Well, hello and welcome to Rare Classic Cars, again from the tranquil setting on a beautiful day here on the weekend. It's about 50 degrees outside. Today I thought I would talk about some specifics about the worst elements of some Ford engines. And by and large, Ford made a lot of good engines, at least V8 engines. We'll get to some of the 6 and the 4 cylinders later. And yes, the 4-liter is coming for those of you who have mentioned that. But today I wanted to talk a little bit about a part on the Ford V8s that really just, for lack of a better term and a bad pun, bogged them down. What is that part? The Motorcraft 4300 4-barrel carburetor, or 4 Venturi carburetor, as Ford would call it. So introduced in 1967 and continuing in through 1974, it was superseded by the Motorcraft 4350 at that point, which still wasn't much better. But this carburetor was, from the start, just destined for challenges. It was really designed as an emissions-based carburetor to help Ford and its engines meet all the forthcoming emission standards, and that's usually not a good thing when it comes to performance. Consequently, in 1967, when it came out, it was 441 CFM. A 4-barrel carburetor, it's 441 CFM. That's it. By comparison, a lot of quadrajets are 800 CFM, and this is 441. That really lasted pretty much 1 year, and then by 1968, most of the Ford engines had gone to a 600 CFM version of the carburetor. And for those who don't know, CFM is cubic feet per minute. Basically, how much airflow can the carburetor ingest and then have it exit out of the carburetor into the engine. So the 1967 version of this carburetor is particularly terrible. And it's really funky too, because it has the idle speed is set with this huge half-inch diameter screw on the back of the carburetor, the only year where that's true. 1968 has a more conventional way of, more conventional idle stop screw, which is very thin, but on the driver's side, and you can turn it in or out to adjust the idle, so long as you don't have an idle stop solenoid on yours that came out a bit later. But where do I start with this? The fuel inlet is not great. A lot of people also, the fuel inlet has a filter that you screw in. A lot of people really crank on that filter and think they have to thread it all the way up into the carburetor body. That's not what you want to do. When you do that, you spread the threads in the carburetor, and then it has a tendency to leak. So don't do that. You want to get these tight, but look at where it is before you take the old one off. Look at the positioning, and you kind of want to get it there or maybe slightly more snug. It's not something that you want to keep cranking and cranking and cranking down, because you'll spread the threads in the carburetor, and then you got to put an insert in, which is not fun. So that's the first issue. The second issue is these things were jetted very, very lean from the factory, and it's not easy to replace the jets. You got to take the whole carburetor off. It's not like a Holley carburetor. You got to take the whole carburetor apart, and then you can change the main jets. You can change the power piston, spring, etc. But they're jetted very lean from the factory, and consequently, particularly in cold weather, they have a tendency to bog, not operate quite right, in part because of a third issue, the accelerator pump. The accelerator pump on these is such a lousy design. The accelerator pumps, like on a quadrajet or even the Autolite 2100 carburetors, they're direct acting. When you step on the gas, it pushes a lever, it squirts fuel into the throat of the carburetor to richen the mixture when you've got large changes in throttle. Well, the Motorcraft 4300 decided, as opposed to having the lever directly actuate the accelerator pump, it in effect lowers a lever that allows a spring to push the accelerator pump down. So this lever is holding this accelerator pump in place, and then when you step on the gas, it drops, and then that allows the internal spring to the carburetor to push the accelerator pump down, forcing the gas through the system. It's just not very positive action, and also contributes to bogginess and lean conditions when you're trying to accelerate with any sort of speed. Other issues, I talked about 1967, the relatively small small size of it, both the primary and the secondary bores or venturis. But they also had challenges with the secondary throttle plate sticking. So if you floored it and then you backed off, sometimes they wouldn't close all the way, and then the car would idle high until you shut it off, and then you restart it and it'll return back to idle. Very common problem on these. Another very, very common problem is they use a dual needle and seat float design. So there's one float, it's got like I don't know if I'd call it a U shape, but they have two needles and seats. And these carburetors operated off of about 5.5, 6 psi. That's it. So your faucet in your sink is 35, 40 psi. This carburetor is operating off of 5.5 to 6. So imagine having, let's call it a fifth of the power or a sixth of the power of your sink faucet. That's why those little needles that don't weigh much are effective in blocking the fuel off from the carburetor, unless they heat soak, which is another issue of these carburetors, and then the fuel bubbles. The fuel line takes all the radiant heat from the engine. The fuel boils, overcomes the needle because it's bubbling, and it lets gas into the carburetor, which then causes it to flood a little bit, and you go to have hard start issues and things like that. That was another issue with these. But that dual float design, the dual needle and seat design, is also really bad because the secondary needle and seat is only held in place by gravity. So if you're running a fuel pump, and a lot of aftermarket fuel pumps that people put on these pump out a bit more than the 5.5, 6. They usually pump out 7, 8. Doesn't sound like a big difference, but it's enough to have the fuel flow overcome that secondary needle and seat, causing the car to flood out. So I learned this when I rebuilt the one in my Lincoln Mark IV carburetor. I rebuilt the carburetor, it must have been 7 or 8 times, and I could not figure out what was going on. I put new needles and seats in, put it all back together, put it on the car, started it up, it would start right up, and then 3 or 4 seconds later, gas was bubbling all over the place. And these carburetors, even from new, had a tendency to flood out. That was very, very common. So I took it apart, would do it again, and all the carburetor kits come with the primary and the secondary needle and seat, and I just couldn't figure it out. Then I read on a forum that the secondary needle and seat was known for being very troublesome, particularly with some of these aftermarket fuel pumps. And if you have a car with low mileage, which my Lincoln Mark IV was, and it's got a replacement fuel pump, often those fuel pumps put out a little more pressure than normal in particularly low mileage cars, because they're set up so that if the fuel pump cam that activates the lever arm that pumps the fuel is slightly worn, as it would be in higher mileage engines, it's not going to make much of a difference. On a low mileage car where there's not much wear on that cam, then you're pumping a little bit too much fuel and too much pressure in the line for that secondary needle and seat. So they do sell plugs. There's a place, this is not an paid endorsement, but I'm just letting people know where you can get it. Go to Mike's Carburetor Parts and he'll sell a secondary needle and seat plug for these Motorcraft carburetors. You just unscrew the one that's there and you put this plug in and it's blocked off and your problem is solved. You don't need this secondary needle and seat unless you're doing quarter-mile drag strip, whatever, in which case you don't want this carburetor in your car anyway because it's not good. I would say that is the most challenging issue with these carburetors, is the flooding out conditions. And then they also, in some cases, they kind of leaked a little bit. They just weren't, if you floored it, then sometimes they bogged. And especially if you hadn't floored it in a while, they just were very, very challenging carburetors. So I own vehicles, I own a lot of cars with this carburetor on it. And yes, I do still run them. But the cars that I bought that came with where somebody put an Edelbrock on it, I haven't restored them to stock condition, even though I have the stock carburetor, because it runs way better with the Edelbrock on it, to be completely honest. Much better throttle tip in. These are very lean, so you don't get much response until the power piston starts richening the mixture, unless you change the jets. I find I upsize the jets in these by about 4 thousandths. So you'll see on the jets there'll be numbers. Like on the 460s, I think it's 62F is the number. On the 390s, I think it's 48F. Obviously a little smaller jet for a smaller engine. You don't need as much fuel. I usually go about 4 thousandths above what it says on the stock, and that tends to make it run a lot better. Otherwise, it's pretty boggy, and you have to wait until the power piston activates at about a third throttle to get moving with any sort of speed. So, in any case, I thought I would just share some tips on this awful carburetor that Ford had. Never really improved it all that much. It was still troublesome at the end of its run. And if you have a 2-barrel Ford carburetor, like an Autolite 2100, it's just all the more strange, because those 2 barrels are great. They are rock solid, reliable, easy to find parts for, easy to service. I think they're great 2-barrel carburetors. External accelerator pumps, so if the diaphragm goes bad, you can just change that with taking out the 4 little screws, taking out the diaphragm, putting in a new diaphragm, put the screws back in and bolt it up, and you're done. Not so with this carburetor. It's atrocious. The choke pull-off is also not really adjustable. So if you don't have the right vacuum when the car starts, or sometimes when it's just really cold, the choke will load up and doesn't want to open as much, in part because the little piston is and the bore that it rides in, now that these cars are 50, well, no, more than that, they're 60 years old. Almost in some cases. They're 50, 60 years old. They tend to stick a little bit. So my best advice, if you have one of these and you want to keep it totally stock, plug off the secondary needle and seat. That's a good starting point. And if you want the thing to run right, put on some other brand of carburetor. Until next time, hope you enjoyed this particular chat. Take care. Thanks for watching this video on what I think is the worst Ford carburetor of all time, the Motorcraft 4300. Hope you learned a few things and tips and tricks if you're having trouble with yours. If you did, please make sure you like and subscribe. You can subscribe by clicking the icon of the 67 Riviera at the top left. Also check out some videos at the bottom left and bottom right if you're new to the channel. And until next time, thanks again for watching and take care.